Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. We're going to shift gears in the podcast now. We've spent a lot of time talking about interpreting Scripture in light of its own context. And we talked about worldview context and lots of historical backgrounds and becoming acquainted with ancient literature, again, that helps us think the writer's thoughts after him, helps us sort of recapture mentally the worldview of the biblical writer so we can partake in the intellectual tradition that was going on around him, the intellectual source material that really formed his world, his worldview. So we spent a lot of time talking about that and resources for doing that. And then in this series on interpreting the Bible in light of its own context, we shifted into literary contexts, different genres. That was all a precursor to what we're going to embark on today. And that is, we're going to get into words, really word level meaning, working in the text at the word level, specifically interpreting the words that we read in a given passage. Now, this is going to be sort of a precursor episode, something that will set up the next few episodes in the series. So take it for what it is. Just by way of introduction, I want to start you thinking about the kinds of things that we sort of assume that may not really be true or may not really be good thinking when it comes to studying words, studying the text, the words of Scripture, and also to start thinking about the stuff that will make us better thinkers, that we do need to consider, and things we need to do to get things right when it comes to interpreting words, doing word studies. And I think you can already tell I'm going to go beyond what people traditionally think of as word studies. I think while it's good, people using things like Strong's Concordance to do quote-unquote word studies, it's actually pretty primitive, pretty simplistic. Really, the pejorative term would be shallow, but I don't want to be pejorative here, because I remember in my own personal Bible study that when I finished reading the Bible once or twice, the very first thing I bought after that was a Strong's Concordance. Someone told me that was what I needed to do, and it was a great tool. I mean, for where I was at the time, that was just something that I really benefited a lot from. But the problem is, today we have a lot of pastors who that's what they use. They're using Strong's Concordance to do word study in preparation for sermons. I mean, this is something a layperson should be doing, and really, for my money, I think lay people are capable of so much more that they should be graduating from Strong's kind of material pretty quickly. But the reality is that they don't, and even people who occupy our pulpits are using tools like this that are really subpar. And it's not just an issue of tools, it's an issue of thinking well about what you're actually trying to do when we think of word studies. It goes beyond looking something up in a dictionary or a lexicon. Grammar matters for meaning, and a host of other things matter for meaning. And so when I talk about studying words, yes, I'm going to be talking about and doing some things that might remind you of this thing other people call word studies, but it's just a lot bigger than that. It's a lot broader than that. And so, again, by way of introduction, I want to sort of prep you to help you see the problems. And really, if you're familiar with sort of, word studies as people know it, as it's known today, again, using things like Strong's Concordance and looking things up by Strong's numbers, and then you get a list of possible meanings, and that's it. That's your word study. Pick one. This is going to go well beyond that. And I want to talk about word fallacies. I want to talk about mistakes that are made. I want to talk about just errors in thinking. And so by way of getting started down that road, and we're going to be spending a few podcast episodes on this whole issue, I want you to consider a few introductory thoughts in this episode. Thought number one would be that words mean nothing by themselves. Words they literally don't mean anything. To illustrate this, visualize in your mind, if you were sitting here with me at a computer screen, or we were in a classroom and I was at a whiteboard and I wrote the word R-U-N, the word run, on the board. And I turned to you and I asked you, what does that mean? What would you say? Well, it wouldn't take long to realize that, frankly, the possibilities are just myriad. You really don't know what it means because you don't have any sort of context for it. It's just sitting there by itself. R-U-N, run. And I'm asking you, what does that mean? And frankly, as you stare at it, as you think about it now, it doesn't mean anything, because it could mean practically anything. For instance, if you looked up run in a dictionary, if you assumed, and see, you don't even know if it's a noun or a verb. If you assumed it was a noun, what you're going to actually find is close to 20 different meanings just for the noun. Let me give you a few. Run could be a score in a baseball game. Okay? It could be a race, like the first run of, some particular tournament. Okay? It could actually be a noun and not the verb. A run, if 2 years ago I painted my house, me and my wife did that by hand, and, because we're not professionals, you can walk around our house and you will see a run at certain points of the house. It's a drip, okay? A drip that's solidified, that's dried there. Is that what RUN means? It could be a continued series like of a book, a print run. Okay, it's a series in continuous fashion of, in this case, something that's printed on paper. A run could be an animal path, a dog run at a rest stop or something like that. You get the idea. So even if you could assume correctly it's a noun, and you can't if it's just R-U-N out there in space or on a whiteboard or on a computer screen with nothing around it, it really doesn't mean anything, because it could mean almost anything. There's great variability. You must know certain things about that word before you can even begin to think well about it at all. If it was a verb, then you're even in more of a pickle, because again, if you go back to your Webster's dictionary and you look up run and you consider the verbal possibilities, now you're dealing with 50 or more meanings for R-U-N. Is it something that's faster than a walk? Is it trying to win a political office, to run for president? Okay. Is it a machine that's operating? The machine is running. Okay, run that machine over there. Is it something that's spreading out? Okay, it's running. Something has run all over the table. Okay, is it something that involves a collision? Don't run into the wall. Okay, I mean there are literally 50 or so possibilities in a normal good collegiate dictionary. Just look it up. For R-U-N. The word by itself means nothing. You're paralyzed by it. Okay, what you need is that word to appear in relationship to other words, and also you need some sort of context. Now, we've been spending a lot of time talking about context, again, in the podcast, and what I hope you realize by now is that when I use the word context, yes, I think you do get this by now. I'm not referring to something current, something like the context of modern evangelicalism or the Reformation or anything in the modern world. Really, when I say biblical context, interpreting the Bible in its own context, I mean interpreting the Bible in the context in which it was produced, in which it was written. Okay, we're very clear on that. But have you picked up the fact that there are actually many contexts? There's a context of worldview, There's a religious context. There are cultural contexts. There are literary contexts. And now when you get down to the word level, there are word level contexts as well. And to know what any given word means, you must be proficient, okay? You must have developed skills. You must be competent in all of those contexts. You need to be aware of them. You need to be thinking about them. You need to have good tools to help you think about them, to build your awareness, to raise that in your mind. Again, just to sort of like tools in the belt. I mean, you need to be exercised. You need to be familiar, be really through repetition, through doing this often enough. You need to be exercised into these things just sort of come automatically to you. So that when you read something in Scripture, you're thinking about history, worldview, culture, religion, what's the literary context, what genre, all these sorts of things should just be immediate. And now we're getting into adding to all that word level context. Now, what we usually think of as context in this regard when we're trying to figure out what words mean, unfortunately, we think of, okay, well, there I'm looking at a Bible verse, and I need to be aware of the paragraph. Okay, well, you do. That's okay. And then I need to be aware of the immediately preceding paragraph and the immediately following paragraph. And that's my context. Well, I would suggest to you that that's not wrong, but it's just extraordinarily narrow and limited. Yes, you need to know what's going on before your passage and immediately after your passage. That's true. But that's only one context, and it's actually a really tiny one, too. It says nothing about these bigger contexts that we've been talking about. For instance, beyond, without going back and doing all the backtracking through worldview and history and culture and religion and literary that we've been spending time with on the podcast, even if I don't go back and rehearse all that, context in terms of the writing is actually bigger than just the paragraph before and the paragraph after. There's the context of the author of your book. Now, in some cases, you're not going to know this because we don't know who wrote a particular book, but you know that a book was written, and so somebody wrote it. But your word meaning might be dictated, might be guided, might really be determined by how that word is used throughout the entire work, throughout the entire book. So you might be looking at a very specific verse in John, and you might not think, again, because of how we're trained, and I think often trained inadequately, you might be thinking, okay, to understand what this word in John means, I need to look at the paragraph before, the paragraph after, kind of read through the whole chapter maybe, and now I got to make a decision. It never occurs to you that, hey, how else does John use this word in the entire book? Did John write anything else besides the Gospel of John? Well, sure he did. He wrote 3 letters. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. He also wrote the book of Revelation. Okay, so how does John use the words in other books? Think of Paul. I mean, Paul wrote 13 or so books of the New Testament, and you might be looking at something in Galatians. Well, Paul wrote a lot of things. So it's not just looking at the immediately preceding and the immediately following paragraph in some portion of Galatians that's going to, really zero you in on the meaning of a particular word. Okay, it's certainly going to contribute, but you need to be thinking bigger than that. You need to be thinking about who the author was and what else he wrote. How might, did Paul ever use this word in this same context in another letter? Has it occurred to you to look? Okay, so it's much wider than that, and even wider than a book. There are often cases where word meaning is determined by section of the Bible. For instance, this gets a little bit like genre, but let's say that we have, some large portion of Scripture. Let's take Joshua and Judges. Now, if you read a commentary and you read about the introduction of the book, sort of what scholars think about the authorship of this book, you would very quickly discern, whether you're in evangelical circles or outside, that it's a pretty common assumption that it's believed that the same person wrote Joshua and Judges, very close to each other. The same person would have been working on that and producing both of those books. So that isn't something that is just sort of going to stick out to you, because neither of the books assert or state who the author is, but there are lots of good reasons to think that the same person wrote both. So if you were not aware of that, if you're trying to do a word study in Judges and you never look at how a word's used in Joshua, you could really come out with a skewed conclusion about what's going on. So there's even the bigger issue of whole sections of Scripture. And even when we don't have the same author in a section, let's take the Psalms, or even like one of the 5 books of the Psalms. You might not be aware that Psalms is divided into 5 books. A lot of your Bibles will mark those books, but we have multiple authors in Psalms, but they're the same kind of literature, and the books are typically arranged. There is actually some logic to this. Again, you would know this had you done reading, if you were in the Psalms trying to do a study there. If you'd read some background about the book, you would be alerted to this. Well, if it occurs in the first book of the Psalms, which is I think the first 42 or something like that, then that might influence the way we look at the word that we're studying. Again, thinking in bigger sections. So there might be some specific occasion to a larger section of Scripture. So right away, we're well beyond this, again, immediately and preceding and following paragraph and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot to think about when it comes to studying words, and that's what we want to do in the next few episodes of the podcast series. So to try to summarize all this that I've just sort of rambled a little bit on, when we talk about understanding word meaning, we need to ask, well, what determines meaning? And the answer is context. Context is king. Context always determines meaning. But then we have to ask, well, what does that mean? What does context mean? Well, it means lots of things. There are lots of different contexts. Again, worldview, historical, cultural, religious, literary, and then you get down to the word level, and what we're going to find is that at the word level, word meaning is going to be determined by several things. And this is a little bit of a preview as to some things we'll get to in future episodes of the podcast. There is the form of a word. In academia, that's called morphology. The way a word is shaped or spelled actually dictates meaning. Let me give you an example in English. If I put the word chaste, chaste, on the board, again in our hypothetical classroom, and I asked you, hey, what does that mean? Okay, you would be able to sort of parse that out a little bit, at least give me a few possibilities for chaste. Now, if I added an N to it, I changed the shape, the form of the word. Now it spells chasten. Now what does it mean? Well, it means something quite different than chaste. And all I did was add an N. Okay, I changed the shape of the word. Okay, word meaning is going to be affected by the shape, the form of a word. So we'll get into that. Word meaning, again, at the word level, is going to be influenced by word relationships. It's a word's relationship to the words that are around it. Okay, and then we also just talked about how an author or how a section of Scripture employs or uses a word. So all of those things, the bigger contexts, and then these word level issues, these word level contexts, all of them combine and work together to produce what the scholar would call a range of semantic possibilities for the meaning of that word, a semantic range. So it's far more complicated. It requires thinking. It's far more complicated than I'm going to look this word up in Strong's dictionary, and I look in Strong's, and Strong gives me 4 or 5 possibilities for what this Greek or Hebrew word means. And then what usually happens is we look at our passage, we look at Strong's list, and we sort of try to plug them in, and we pick the one that we like. Okay, or we pick the one that we think works best. That isn't word study. What that is that's cherry picking a lexicon, to be bluntly honest about it. Okay, there are many more possibilities than you're going to find in a tool like Strong's or in a lot of other tools, a lot of other lexicons, because it's very rare. There are some exceptions to this, some modern tools that will help you, but this is kind of an exhaustive process. It could take a person's whole lifetime to produce a lexicon and do all this kind of work for every word. So you're not going to escape from having to think about things, and that's a good thing, again. But we need to be able, again, to train ourselves to realizing that there's no substitute for thinking. Okay, and when we think about words, we need to be thinking about all these things we've been talking about, all these contexts. And once we do that, we will be able to develop our own range of semantic possibilities for a word using different tools, again, that will help us think, using different techniques that will help us think about a word. And we can make a more intelligent choice. We can make a more informed choice, have a more informed understanding of what a particular word means in a particular place that we're trying to study, a particular passage in the Bible. So what I'm arguing for is I'm not going to give you a silver bullet that's going to give you the word meaning in every passage, any given passage. But what you will learn is that there are things you can do, there are tools that you can use to help you think, and there are just things you need to be alerted to. Your awareness needs to be raised that you need to think a certain way or think about a certain issue that will help you make informed decisions as to how to interpret something you're reading. So that's our goal, again, for the next few episodes of the podcast, and I hope you'll stay with us for that. Thanks for tuning into the Naked Bible Podcast again. In this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be playing some audio of myself and using it for the podcast episode. I recently created a video that I'm going to provide a link to on the Naked Bible Podcast site under Bibliography and Resources so you can actually watch the video. But I'm going to be using the audio from that video in lieu of our episode today because the video was about exegetical fallacies. These are fallacies that are often committed when doing word studies. And we're continuing here with doing word-level work in the biblical text, trying to do meaningful and sound research in the biblical text. And so I thought, having had to create that other video, that it would be really useful to do this for the podcast as well. So I've taken the audio from that. There's only one or two places where it might benefit you to actually look or be looking at the video. So I would say you don't even really need that to listen to the podcast episode, but you may want to go back and watch the video anyway. So I gave you the link. But today on the Naked Bible Podcast, we're going to be covering exegetical fallacies, or how to do bad Bible study, or how to do bad, flawed word studies. So sit back and enjoy, and here comes the audio from that lesson. One of the things that biblical scholars and really scholars who do translation for a living, do Bible interpretation, linguists, those sorts of people, one of the things that we run into a lot with non-specialists especially, people who want to be doing research in books like the Bible and are very well-meaning, and frankly we wouldn't want to discourage that, but this issue of exegetical fallacies seems to come up a lot. An exegetical fallacy is a phrase that is probably not really familiar to you if you're not a specialist, if you're not a biblical scholar, if you don't work in Bible interpretation regularly. But it's a very common phrase for scholars. Everybody knows what an exegetical fallacy is, and a whole list of the possibilities, different kinds of exegetical fallacies. What I want to do here is show you some of the more common ones and basically make the point, again, people might not like to hear this, but it's true. A lot of the research you read on the internet, a lot of the research you'll read in books that is done by non-specialists, people who lack the credentials in biblical language work, in translation skills. They lack the academic backgrounds in these things. A lot of what you read will just be littered and cluttered with exegetical fallacies, and that is the material you're reading, the conclusions that are drawn, what you're getting from that thing you're reading, whether it's a book or a blog or a website, is wrong. Because languages just don't work the way that a lot of these researchers try to make them work or want to believe they work. I'm going to illustrate that here. So I have here 5 of the more common fallacies. The foreign root fallacy, that is the idea that we get the meaning of a particular English word based upon its Latin or Greek root that you can find like in Webster's dictionary. Then there's the root fallacy, the idea that a shared root among several words somehow determines the meaning of those words. Then there's something called the etymological fallacy, where supposedly the constituent parts of words, when you take them apart and then put them back together, that determines the meaning of the word. Fourth, there's the sound fallacy, and this takes 2 varieties. The idea that shared sounds between words in the same language means that they have a shared meaning. And the second variety is that shared sounds between words in a different language, between 2 different languages, or 3 or whatever, that somehow allows the meaning of those words, the meaning of the words between the different languages, to be shared, essentially to be mixed and matched, or to dictate meanings in the other languages from one of the different languages. And lastly, there's the totality transfer fallacy. This is the idea that when you have a word, and a word can have any number of meanings, a broad range of meanings, that somehow there's one meaning that unites them, sort of one ring to rule them all, or that you could transfer, some sort of meaning. You collect all the possible meanings and you sort of get to a basic meaning, and then that sort of contributes to our understanding of that word wherever it occurs, no matter the context. Now, all of these are fallacies. They're well known to scholars, and if you're doing Bible interpretation using these methods, your interpretation is going to be wrong. It's going to be flawed. Let me give you illustrations of each one. The foreign root fallacy, again, that's the idea that the meaning of an English word is determined by, in this case, this illustration, a Latin root. Now, why is this a fallacy? Well, one illustration, our word nice comes from the Latin nescius, which means ignorant. Now, it's very obvious that the Latin root meaning does not transfer to the English word nice. And so you can tell very easily from this example that it doesn't matter what the Latin root was. It doesn't matter what that Latin root meant. It has nothing to do with the word that has evolved in English. What determines word meaning always, the golden rule, is context. Context is king. Context determines meaning. And when I say context, it means a range of things. It can mean the historical background is a factor. That gives us a context. The type of literature, literary genre, is a context. Religious background of the writer is a context. Cultural background is a context. The paragraph preceding and the paragraph following our particular word or passage that we're looking at, that forms a context. Even the location of our word and its relationship to other words in the same sentence forms a context. These are the kinds of things that need to inform your understanding of a word's meaning, not an original root from another language. Second one, the root fallacy. Again, this is the idea that shared roots determine meaning. Really? Again, this is easy to illustrate as a fallacy. In Greek, the word timao means to honor. There's another word in Greek, epitimao, which means to rebuke. Now, those two terms very obviously share a root, tim, tim. Now, this fallacy, if we were to employ it, would have Jesus honoring demons And it would change one of the 10 commandments to rebuke your parents instead of honor your parents. Look at the illustration. Matthew 19:19, we have timao your father and mother. Honor your father and mother. And in Mark 1:25 and 26, Jesus is confronting a demon, and we read, but Jesus epitimao him. Jesus rebuked him, saying, be silent and come out of him. And the unclean spirit came out of him. Now, if the root sort of united or fused these two, and you could sort of derive a shared meaning, you could interchange them, but you very obviously can't interchange these things here, because like I said, you'd have Jesus honoring demons, and you'd be commanded by God to rebuke your parents. They're not interchangeable. And you can see from the examples, timao and epitimao, their meanings, you can't really come up with a common ancestor, so to speak, a common meaning ancestor out of which both honor and rebuke could come. They are mutually exclusive ideas. Okay? So the root fallacy just falls apart here. This is not how meaning is determined. Meaning is determined by context, and again, there's a whole range of contexts. Just remember, context is king. Third one, the etymological fallacy, which is a fun one. This is the idea that constituent parts of words determine meaning. Two illustrations in Greek, anaginosko. Okay, there's a verb, anaginosko, two parts, ana, which means up or above, and ginosko, which means to know. Now you would think, if we could just take the word apart into its constituent parts, ana and ginosko, the meaning, therefore, would be something like to know up or to know above, which doesn't make any sense. Anaginosko, though, actually means to read. Okay, the constituent parts have nothing to contribute to that. Next one, epitimao. We just saw this in the previous fallacy. Epi means on or at or upon, and then timao by itself would be to honor. So you would think if you pulled these apart and looked at their constituent parts, we'd have to honor at or to honor upon. But that isn't what it means. We just saw that it means to rebuke. Again, the constituent parts do not create the meaning. English has a whole host of these. Butterfly. Butter and fly, okay, are not going to give you the meaning of butterfly. Butter doesn't fly, and flies are not buttery. Okay? Headship. Okay? Head and ship. Okay, the head, the thing on top of your shoulders, and ship, some big craft that floats in the water. You put those together, they have nothing to do with the meaning of headship, which is leadership. I hope you get the point. But this fallacy is just ubiquitous. It just shows up everywhere in so much material that you read by non-specialists, by amateurs, amateur researchers, especially people who are trying to go back into ancient texts in the ancient world, including the Bible, and study it and do research. Their conclusions are often terribly flawed. Next one, the sound fallacy. Two varieties here again. The first one is that shared sounds between words in the same language create a shared meaning or allow a shared meaning. Two English examples here. The words wine and wine. Okay, there's no relationship. There's no inherent semantic relationship between the two. And you wouldn't interpret either that way. The same thing for rain, R-A-I-N, and reign, R-E-I-G-N. One is water that falls from the sky, and the other is kingship or rulership. There's no relationship between them, even though they sound exactly the same. Second variety here, shared sounds between words in different languages. Do those allow meaning of those words, meanings to be transferred from one language to the other? Does one set of sounds in one language inform our understanding of the same set of sounds in another? Again, you'll see this everywhere. People on the internet, like William Henry, I think of right away, does this sort of thing. Actually, William Henry does all of these fallacies and does them frequently. But he's especially fond, I guess, of this one, these sort of sound relationships. The fact that I can make a set of sounds in English does not mean that the same set of sounds in Chinese carries the meaning that my English word does, and vice versa. The reverse is true. Examples. In Hebrew, we have yam, yam, or yam, and in English we have yam. Okay, we know what in English a yam is. It's a sweet potato, okay? In Hebrew, yam or yam is a body of water, like a sea or a lake. Hebrew, the next one, bo. This is a verb in Hebrew. It means to go or to come or to arrive, as opposed to the English word bow, the noun, like bow and arrow. Again, there's just no relationship. It doesn't matter that they sound the same. One doesn't inform the other. Last one, the Hebrew word kol, which is a word that means all or every or whole, entire. And in English, coal, C-O-A-L. Again, obviously no relationship at all. But yet this is done all the time, both by people who want to interpret the Bible and people who want to interpret other ancient texts. Last one, the totality transfer fallacy. This is the attempt to engage in the transfer of all meanings of a word in any given passage and import that, somehow import all the meanings into any given occurrence of the word anywhere. Or again, to sort of take all the meanings and try to come up with one base meaning and then impose that everywhere else that word occurs. It just doesn't work this way. Languages do not work this way. Some funny examples. If I said about a friend, he has a fetching wife. Well, I don't mean that she's a dog, and if he threw something, she'd run and go grab it with her mouth and bring it back. Okay, fetching can mean that as a verb, but in this instance, in this context, okay, the word wife tells you what we mean. Again, the context of the words around the word we're interested in. In this context, it means he has an attractive wife. Okay. Next one, you need to brand yourself. Well, ouch, that would hurt, wouldn't it, if you took a hot iron and plastered it against your skin and watched it burn a little bit, burn a symbol on yourself. No, that isn't at all what we're talking about. Branding can, in business parlance, in business context, again, refers to building a reputation or building notoriety, building recognition of either yourself or a product. Lastly, I'm spoiled. Well, does that mean that I need to be taken out and thrown in the trash because we can't eat you anymore? Again, you get the idea. Context is everything. We wouldn't take a word like spoiled or fetching or brand and make a list like I've done here below with English board. Just try it. We wouldn't list out meanings and then sort of scratch our heads and think, okay, what common base meaning can I contrive? And that's what you're doing. Can I invent? Can I fabricate? That could sort of explain all of these possibilities. And when I get that, that must be the fundamental, the base, almost the divine meaning of this word. And that I can therefore take to any place, any verse, if we're doing Bible stuff, and import that meaning into that passage. That's illegitimate. That's a fallacy. Languages do not work this way. English board, I think, some words just have a multitude of meanings. If this was a noun, it could be a piece of sawed lumber. It could be daily meals, like in the phrase room and board. It could be a council or association. I earned a place on the board. The side of a ship. Electrical panel, circuit board, a writing surface, like a whiteboard. If it's a verb we're talking about, it could mean to climb on or to seal up, like you board up a window, preparing for a hurricane or something. Or it could be you smash another hockey player, into the boards. You check them. Check it would be a word that we could use to illustrate this too. Again, languages just don't work this way. These are word games that amateur researchers play, and the result is flawed, misguided, and in some cases harmful interpretation. It just ought not to be. Remember, context is king. And context, again, means all the things I mentioned before. Historical context, worldview, the worldview context of the writer, the religious context, the cultural context. What made the person think as he or she did? Again, all the things that inform them intellectually, those are all context. Then we have literary context. What type of writing? If I was looking at the word will, W-I-L-L, I would think of it differently if I had in my hand a legal document, something that came from a lawyer. Okay, that the type of literature dictates how I'm going to take words that appear in that piece of literature. So literary context is important. Again, all these things, the way the word relates to other words around it, these are contexts. And context is king in interpretation. Not exegetical fallacies, and not word games like this. Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. Today I'm going to continue with our series on Bible study at the word level. Last time we talked about exegetical fallacies that arise from flawed word study methods. In this episode, though, I wanted to transition to some important elements that go into word study, something positive, something that you want to do. Today we'll primarily be focused on examining a word as it's used by a single author throughout the material that author wrote. In this case, the Apostle Paul. But the word I've chosen for our focus also means that we'll be getting into the issue of a word's distribution across a corpus. In this case, obviously, the New Testament. Now, since this example that I've picked is so restrictive, again, since my primary interest in this episode is a single author's use, as opposed to a wider distribution, I'll probably return to word distribution when doing word studies in a future episode. But let's just jump into what we want to cover today. I want to get started by turning to 1 Corinthians 7. Now, during the course of the podcast that follows, as we go on here, I'll be talking about specific words in 1 Corinthians 7. I've reproduced the important sections of the chapter on the podcast website. It's episode 32. And I have certain words colored and marked for reasons that I'll indicate as we proceed here. You can reference that material as you listen or go back and look at it afterwards. I'll also mention certain Greek lexicons. Those are specialized dictionaries that cover a specific corpus in a language, in this case the New Testament, and again some of the eras that are related to the New Testament. There are links to those tools that I'll mention under episode 32 at the Bibliography and Resources tab on the podcast website. So without further ado, let's jump into 1 Corinthians 7. Now, you've probably read this chapter before. It's a controversial chapter. Paul is dealing with marriage and divorce and remarriage and betrothal and all these different things about sexual and marital relationships. In the first 7 or 8 verses, he basically sort of gets warmed up and recommends, again, marriage to avoid, sexual immorality and so on and so forth. In verse 8 is where I want to jump in. Paul says, "To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am." I'm reading in the ESV, by the way. "But if they cannot exercise self-control, then they should marry." Now notice, he just said they should marry, and he's recommending that 2 groups marry if they can't remain single, again, because of sexual temptation. And the 2 groups were the unmarried and the widows. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. He says it's just better to marry than to burn with passion. Verse 10, "To the married I give this charge, not I but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, again I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy or sanctified because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy or sanctified because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. As it is, they are sanctified. They're holy. And that's a whole separate issue, what Paul talks about there. He's not talking about salvation. But let's move on. Finally, with verse 15. If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister, the believer, is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. Now, what I want to focus on here is the word unmarried. It occurred 2 times in that section I just read, and if you're looking at the website, the section there, I have them colored in red. To the unmarried and the widows I say, and then Paul talks about the woman who has separated or divorced from her husband, that she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. Now, it's interesting, how do we define unmarried? What does that mean? Well, it occurs 2 times here, and it's actually going to occur only 4 times in the entire New Testament. And guess what? We've seen 2 of them here. The other 2 occurrences are also in this chapter. If we go down to verses 32 and through 34, we get the other 2 occurrences. Let me just pick them up for you. Paul says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man, there's the word again, unmarried, is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit, so on and so forth. So there's your other 2 occurrences of unmarried. Now, what this means is that this word, unmarried, occurs 4 times in the entire New Testament, all of them in this chapter, and therefore all of them are used by the Apostle Paul. It's not found anywhere else. So I'm going to suggest to you that we should allow Paul, since he's the one who uses it, and it's used only here, we should allow Paul to tell us how to understand the range of meanings that he would have in his mind for the word unmarried, for what constitutes an unmarried person. Now, if we look this up in a Greek lexicon, and the lemma here, the Greek lemma is agameo. If we looked it up in something like Bauer, Donker, Arndt, and Gingrich's Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian lit, BDAG as it's called by users and those of us in the field, if we looked it up in BDAG or maybe Liddell Scott's Greek-English lexicon, which covers more historical eras than just the New Testament and early Christian literature, we would discover that agameo, unmarried, is used by Greek writers in all different periods for all of the expected states of being spouseless. I mean, at the heart of it, that's what unmarried means. I am in a state of not having a spouse. Okay, whatever constitutes that state or whatever led to that state is the issue. But if you are in the state of being where you do not have a spouse, you are by definition unmarried. Now, unmarried can mean several things. It can mean that you've never been married at all ever before in your life, with or without having a virginal status or not. The virgin, in fact, is covered by a different term that's actually used in this chapter as well, parthenos. But if you're a virgin, you've never been sexually active, and therefore you've never been married, you would be agameo, you would be unmarried. Okay? But you could be unmarried if you had been married before and are now in the state of being spouseless. And that would cover people like those who have been divorced or those who are widowed or widowers. And it would also cover a situation where you were married but your spouse has deserted you or abandoned you, just left you. And that is implied in this chapter, in the sections we just read, although the vocabulary that Paul uses for separating is used elsewhere within and without the New Testament for divorce. Okay, so I'm just casting a wide net here, because the Greco-Roman culture, again, this is the cultural time of the New Testament, the culture in which Paul was writing, the culture in which the people who live, that are receiving Paul's letter, are living. We can't assume that the ancient culture, and in fact it didn't, had the same sort of legal categories that our culture does. I mean, we have a category called separated that isn't actually divorced. Well, again, we make that distinction, but with what Paul's dealing with, a separation, a forsaking, an abandoning, for whatever reason, including an unequal marriage in terms of spiritual status, you're Christian and non-Christian, where he's in the passage we just read, he's saying, look, this could happen. Your spouse could just leave you because you're a believer. If that happens, well, you let them go, but you're not a slave. You're not enslaved to that person. So it's a little bit different. It's one of those things where it's kind of the same and kind of different as well, two sides of that coin. We can't assume the same categorizations. What Paul is dealing with when he talks about separation of partners is really a practical divorce. I mean, it is something that results in a permanent condition, whether it would have the legal standing or not, and whether we would be able to match it with some of the legalese that we use today. It's a practical divorce situation. So what does all that mean? Why does it all matter? How is it that this is the centerpiece of what we want to talk about on the podcast today? Well, it's important to understand, to correctly interpret what an author is saying, to know how he's using a term, what is included and what can be excluded. And in some cases, it's not easy to determine what could be included or excluded. But here, Paul is the only person who uses this term, and he actually describes certain conditions that help us to determine what unmarried could mean. So let's go back to verse 8. Paul says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say. Now right there, this tells you that when Paul uses the word unmarried, most likely the people who would be spouseless there are not including widows or widowers, because he follows up unmarried with the very term widows. So we have widows, we know what they are. Their spouse has died, or a widower, obviously. So that means that unmarried could include any of those other circumstances as well. Again, never been married or divorced, or again, a practical divorce through desertion or separation. So Paul's speaking to different groups here. The unmarried and the widows, I say, it's good for them to remain single, as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. He follows that in verse 10. To the unmarried I give this charge, the wife should not separate from her husband. Don't leave your husband. Don't divorce your husband. Now, the word there is chorizo, which means to divide, to create a division or separation, hence the translation separation. In the colored material, I've colored this green with an underline under it. Chorizo is green with the underline. You'll notice there's other green terms. Paul continues in verse 11, this person that shouldn't separate from her husband, I'm recommending don't separate, but if she does, if there is a separation, again, a practical divorce here, a desertion, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce, there's the other green term, his wife. Now this is a different term, it's aphiemi. This is to release or to let go or to just, get rid of. That kind of thing. It's standard divorce language. Now, both of these terms, I've colored them in green because if you'll notice in 1 Corinthians 7, 8 through 15, they are used interchangeably. In other words, they're not strict legal categories or distinctions in and of themselves. They are used interchangeably for and including the situation where a unbelieving spouse deserts, abandons, again, in practical terms, divorces the believing member of the marriage. So they're used interchangeably. Paul's clearly including divorce. Now, here's the issue. There's a lot of controversy about divorce and remarriage. Can a divorced person get remarried and all that sort of thing? Usually on the basis of discussion in the Gospels in Matthew 19. I'll get back to Matthew 19 in a moment, but here we are in 1 Corinthians 7, and Paul clearly includes, both by context and also the semantic range of the word meaning, and he's the only one who uses it. So we can't go outside and get other information, at least in the New Testament. Paul clearly includes people who could be divorced in his discussion of the state of being spouseless, of being unmarried. Now, in verse 11, he recommends that the unmarried person be reconciled to their spouse. Okay, that's obviously his optimal choice. If she does separate, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled with her husband. Again, that's what Paul recommends. But in verse 8, he had said to the unmarried and the widows. He says, if you can't contain, again, if you can't overcome sexual temptation, then you should marry. Again, Paul, I would say it this way. There's no way to approach this passage, this section of Scripture, and legitimately say that Paul could not have had divorced people in mind when he recommends that the unmarried should marry if they can't avoid sexual temptation. Again, I don't know how you would be able to deliberately and cleanly separate, really distinguish or eliminate that meaning, that possible meaning for unmarried from this passage. And it's important because, again, we have situations, just like Paul did, where you have divorced people in the church wondering, can I get remarried or not? What does the Bible say? Well, I would say that there's really no legitimate way to exclude divorced people from Paul's discussion here. If we go down, in fact, to the other two occurrences of unmarried, they're very generic, again, talking about just the state of being spouseless, and if you're single, you'll be thinking more about the things of the Lord, and if you're married, you get distracted because you have a wife or a spouse to please, and all that sort of thing. We can see here in verse 34, Paul addresses the unmarried and the betrothed woman, okay? So, again, it creates the distinct possibility, I would say the likelihood, that here unmarried is being set off from betrothed, from the virgin. So earlier in the chapter, Paul's use of the term unmarried told us that it could be distinct from someone who was widowed or a widower, and here it could be distinct from someone who's a virgin. The word betrothed here in verse 34 is parthenos. It's the word for virgin. So again, we have clear indications that when Paul uses the word unmarried, it's very likely that he is including in that word the idea that you are spouseless because you've been divorced formally, or you've been divorced practically. Your spouse has abandoned you, has deserted you. Again, how would we look at the four occurrences of unmarried in this chapter and be able to exclude divorced people from what Paul says? Because Paul clearly says in verse 8, if you can't contain, you should get married. In fact, if you go to verse 27 and verse 28, listen to what Paul says here. He says, are you bound to a wife? Are you married? Well, don't seek to be free. Again, don't try to get out of the marriage. Are you free from a wife? Okay, you're not married. Do not seek a wife. Again, the context here, he's going to say in verse 28, is worldly troubles, and he's just alluded to, in fact, in verse 26, the present distress. Again, there's some sort of situation, most scholars think it's persecution, where Paul is recommending, hey, just stay as you are, don't get married, don't have kids because of the suffering and all that sort of thing. And that gets into what the Roman persecutors would do to Christian wives and Christian children, especially daughters and that sort of thing. That it was a serious thing. They could do horrific things to them. And so Paul is just sort of recommending everybody stay where they're at. But he says, look, if you're bound to a wife, don't try to get out of the marriage. If you're free from a wife, hey, my advice is don't seek to get married. In verse 28, but if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Again, there's that word betrothed. Okay, it's parthenos, it's a virgin. So he's talking to two broad categories of people who are unmarried. One of them is virgins. So that means the others who are in the state of being spouseless, if they do marry, they have not sinned. Again, you see what we're saying here, what we're angling for here is, if we're going to be talking about the legitimacy of remarriage in the church, this question, we must go to 1 Corinthians 7. We must include it in our discussion. And we must let Paul define what an unmarried individual is. And there's no way, based upon the word's meaning and the context in which it occurs, and these are the only 4 occurrences that there are in the New Testament, there's no way to exclude divorced people from the permission to remarry. Again, this is what I'm angling for, what I'm talking about here. Now, the logical question is, what about Matthew 19? Where the whole statement of Jesus, except it be for fornication, you can get married or not remarried. If you remarry, you end up committing adultery and all that sort of thing. Well, the truth is that it's beyond the scope of this podcast, but that saying is actually controversial. Grammatically, it could work either way. It could either disallow remarriage or it could allow remarriage, depending on the situation of how the initial divorce occurred, whether there was adultery involved in that or not. So it's not very clear. It's not actually clear, again, in scholarly discussion anyway, that statement disallows remarriage. I would also add this. The reason Paul never references the teaching here of Jesus, I think, is twofold, because Paul's talking about divorce and remarriage in this whole chapter of 1 Corinthians 7. Why doesn't he quote Jesus? Well, he probably doesn't quote him because the Gospel of Matthew, and I would say Mark for that matter, had not yet been written. 1 Corinthians has some clear chronological markers that you could, again, look up in a New Testament introduction talking about 1 Corinthians. Scholars are very able to date 1 Corinthians to the mid-50s AD. About 55 is the date that people usually target. So let's just go with it. Mid-50s. Matthew is almost universally considered by scholars to have been written sometime before 70 and likely just before 70. Again, for a number of indications we can't go into here. So Paul would never have seen it because Matthew wasn't written yet. Mark is usually considered a little earlier, and the earliest you can put Mark is the mid-50s, the same as 1 Corinthians. And so it's very likely that Paul never saw it. Mark is writing somewhere else. Paul is out ministering to the Gentiles, and that's why he doesn't quote it. The other issue is that Jesus is addressing the question from within Jewish culture, with a touch point, of course, to the Old Testament. Paul isn't doing that here. Paul is writing to Corinthians. He's addressing the situation on the ground in Greco-Roman culture, the situations that were present in real Greco-Roman life, and his own present distress, the present persecution situation within this predominantly Gentile church here in the city of Corinth. Entirely different contexts for what Paul's dealing with and what Jesus was commenting when he's confronted by the scribes and the Pharisees there. So I would argue that there's not going to be an inconsistency when it's all settled and done. But again, that's really beyond the scope of this particular podcast episode. But just sticking with what Paul's saying here, it's really nigh unto impossible, because the word usage is so restricted, again, to Paul, both in terms of distribution and its use by New Testament authors. He's the only one, it's only 4 times, and it's all right here. It's nigh unto impossible to exclude divorced people from what Paul says here about the unmarried in 1 Corinthians 7. So I like to use this illustration as, again, a good illustration, I think, of the importance of, when you're doing word studies, taking note of not only where the word is used and how many times and all that sort of thing, but how does a particular author use the term? Is there consistency within the way an author uses a particular term? Does an author always use the term the same way? Again, you have to be looking at the way a particular writer uses a particular term, the particular word that you're studying. And then, of course, in this case, we get into distribution, because there really isn't any. I mean, it's only 4 times in this particular book. But that's another thing to consider, the isolation or the distribution of how a word is used. Again, to narrow the possibilities, to create situations where you can plausibly discern what the word means in the context. And the context is cultural, and here the context is also literary, the distribution, the actual use of the word. What the word means in context, again, so that you can draw conclusions from the passage based upon your understanding and study of the words. Welcome back to the Naked Bible Podcast. Today we're going to continue with our series on Bible study at the word level. In the last episode, we began talking about word study techniques. Specifically, we focused on examining word use by a single author throughout the material that author wrote. We looked at the case of the Apostle Paul's use of agomeo in 1 Corinthians 7, where only Paul uses that term 4 times in that chapter, and those are the only 4 occurrences in the entire New Testament. Today, I want to talk about considering words in relationship to other words. A word study isn't just a matter of seeing how many times a word occurs. Math isn't part of exegesis. And then going to a lexicon and seeing which English gloss option you like best in a given passage. But that's what most people do. Word study is about word usage, and that takes thought, and careful thought at that, based on careful observation. If you've listened to me for any length of time, you've probably heard me say that there is no substitute for thinking when doing Bible study, and that applies to word study. It's not about just lookups of word occurrences. That's just a step for getting the raw material that you need to think about. I want to illustrate this with the Hebrew word bara. The nuance and significance of bara can only be discerned by noting its use with respect to other words, specifically synonyms and the words that are used as bara's grammatical subject. Now I want to start by noting 2 familiar verses, Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:26. Genesis 1:1 is familiar. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The word created there is the Hebrew word bara. And in Genesis 1:26, we get the familiar passage about the creation of humankind. The verse says, "Then God said, let us make man or humankind in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock," so on and so forth. And then we get to verse 27. "So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." Now we notice right away that in verse 27 we have created, bara, 3 times. What's really interesting, though, is that in the prior verse, verse 26, we have "let us make man." That word is not bara. That verb there is asa. So what we have here is we have the creation of humankind spoken of by 2 terms, not just one. And that tells us that bara and asa are synonyms. They have some relationship. There's some sort of congruence or similarity between them. There's something about them that they share in meaning. There also would be, in that sense, something a little bit different as well. Synonyms are, by definition, words that are similar in meaning, but they're not identical. Okay, there's always a little bit of a nuanced difference between terms. So right away we have learned that bara has at least one synonym. Now it's going to have more than that as well. So the very word that's used in Genesis 1:1 and then in Genesis 1:26 and 27, specifically verse 27, is going to have a synonym. Now that's going to become important because to really understand what bara means and doesn't mean, we have to take note of this. Now I've heard, again in my experience, things about bara that preachers or Bible students or researchers or whatever have said about this term. And they usually like to talk about how unique bara is. That specifically it means creation out of nothing. And they'll usually reference Genesis 1:1 for that. It's bara, it's a special creation. It's not just any normal creation. God speaks and it happens and it exists. It's creation out of nothing. Well, that actually doesn't work, and that actually isn't true about bara. And we've gotten our first clue, believe it or not, by looking at Genesis 1:26 and 27. Now, we've seen in verse 27 that bara is used of the creation of humankind. It also has a synonym, asa. Now, why is that a clue? Well, let me just ask you a really simple question. Again, if those of you who've been doing any Bible study for any amount of time are probably going to know the answer to this immediately. The simple question is this: were humans created out of nothing? The answer to that is very obviously no, that isn't true. If you go to Genesis 2, we get another account of the creation of humankind. In that chapter, we read, for instance, in verse 7, Genesis 2:7, the Lord God formed the man from the soil of the ground. Okay, formed here in Genesis 2:7 is not bara, and it's not asa. It's actually another Hebrew word, yatsar. But we wouldn't even really have to know that. We just read the verse. God is forming the man in the text from something, mainly dirt, okay, the soil of the ground. The man is not created out of nothing. The man is created from something. And the same goes with the woman. And this is important because Genesis 1:27 talks about God baraing humankind, male and female. So if we look in Genesis 2, verse 22, the Lord God made a woman from the part he had taken out of the man. Okay, so right away we also learn that the woman is also not created out of nothing. She's created from something. Now what this tells us, if we take Genesis 1:26 and 27 and Genesis 2, verse 7 and verse 22, if we take all of that together, we've seen now that there are three words that describe the creation of humankind. One of them is bara, another is asa, and the third one is yatsar. They are synonyms. Okay, they have some similarity, but they also have some nuance of difference as well. Very clearly, bara does not mean, in and of itself, to create out of nothing. This is a myth, okay, that's been sort of perpetuated by some, again, well-meaning Bible students that really just didn't even bother to think very carefully about the word and the word's use. And the word's use specifically for our episode today in relationship to other words. Now you say, well, what about Genesis 1? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I mean, surely the use of bara there refers to creation out of nothing, right? Well, I've actually done a lot of work on this passage that is accessible to people who are not scholars. And on the podcast website under Bibliography and Resources, I will link to some video of me talking about this. But Genesis 1 through 3 is actually highly argued about, highly debated, highly disputed as far as what is actually being described there. I personally, and I'm with the majority here, I try to be with mainstream scholarship. I mean, I'm not always there. I'm not afraid to not be there. But in this case, with Genesis 1 through 3, most scholars of Hebrew syntax, Hebrew grammar, would note that Genesis 1 to 3 actually does not describe a creation out of nothing. It depends on how you take the clauses of the first 3 verses, and that's well beyond our subject for this podcast. But if you go to those videos that I've made and linked on the podcast Bibliography and Resources site, you'll be able to watch a full explanation of this that I think is very digestible, again, for someone who doesn't even know Hebrew or Hebrew grammar. It's something I've presented in church several times, and I think you'll be able to follow it. What you have in Genesis 1 through 3 is that God is actually creating, the creative act, let there be light, actually comes with respect to material that is already pre-existing, something that's already there. Now, theologically, we would affirm that, hey, God put that there too, but we don't really get that in Genesis 1. We get that from other passages. Again, watch the video, and that'll be explained to you what I'm talking about there. But for our purposes here, it's kind of interesting that we have in Genesis 1:1 the heavens and the earth barad, created. And you would think, again, that means creation out of nothing. But we've seen that bara is used elsewhere where it very clearly does not mean creation out of nothing. So is this consistent? Well, again, you can see the videos for how Genesis 1 through 3 really does not, in terms of Hebrew grammar, does not tell us that we have a creation out of nothing here in Genesis 1:1. But I want to just show you something that you would probably miss. In reality, the heavens and the earth elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible are described as being made and not barad. In other words, there are other verbs of creative activity that are used to produce the heavens and the earth, and those words are not bara. They're normal words of making things and creating things out of pre-existing material. We actually kind of saw or alluded to one of them already. Genesis 2:4. Now, we were in Genesis 2 and we looked at verse 7, where the God formed the man from the dust of the ground, Yatsar, and we said, hey, when you take that in parallel to Genesis 1:26, it's very clear that since Genesis 2 has humankind being created from something and not out of nothing, that we can't understand bara as speaking of creation out of nothing back in Genesis 1:26. Well, the same thing can be said for the heavens and the earth, because if you go to verse 4 in Genesis 2, we read, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Right there we have bara, but the verse isn't done yet. Heavens and earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the heavens and the earth. There we have asa. It's the same tandem parallel, again, asa and bara, that we saw for the creation of humankind. Now, this isn't the only place. Exodus 20, verse 4, has the heavens and the earth being asad. The verse is asa there, or the word is asa for the production, the producing of the heavens and the earth. Exodus 20, verse 11, Exodus 31:17. There's a whole bunch of these. There's almost 24 instances where the heavens and the earth are not barad. They are brought into existence through another term that isn't quote-unquote as special as bara. It's just the generic word, the generic verb that would be used hundreds and hundreds of times in the Hebrew Bible for making things out of materials. So the heavens and the earth of Genesis 1 are spoken of in the same way by the same verb, despite the fact that in 1:1 the verb happens to be bara. Bara and asa are synonyms, and asa very clearly does not involve any sense of creation out of nothing. So again, we need to be looking at how the Bible itself uses terminology, and not, again, trying to defend a particular view of origins or of creation. Again, even the pre-existing material in Genesis 1, I would argue that other passages, require us to see that God is the originator of that material too. The point is just that Genesis 1 itself doesn't tell us how that material got there. It's just there, and then God starts to work with it. Again, watch the video about the clauses in Genesis 1:1 through 3, and you'll get a better understanding of what I'm saying here. I don't want to rabbit trail on it for the sake of the podcast. Now, we've just looked at bara in relationship to other words, again, synonyms, and that helps us to be informed about what bara means and doesn't mean. It means creation. It means to bring something into being, but it doesn't mean necessarily that creation is out of nothing. Okay, it is quite supportable to say that even bara involves the creative act with pre-existing material. Okay, so we've learned that much. So you say, well, what's the big deal about bara then? Is there anything unique about it? There actually is. Now, what I'm going to tell you and suggest that you do here would be very easy with Bible software such as Logos, where I work, my employer produces. In fact, this is pretty unique. We don't have any competition here. There are no other software packages that can do what I'm going to describe for you here. But what you need to determine, what you need to discover, again, if you have software, it's easy. If you don't, it's a little harder. But bara doesn't occur that many times, so you could do this by hand in a reasonable amount of time. We need to determine what the grammatical subject of bara is. In other words, in all of bara's uses, and there are roughly 50, a little less than 50 of them. So again, you could do it by hand if you wanted to. If you got a list of all the places where bara occurs, look for what does the action. What bara's what, okay? Who is the creator? Okay, who's the grammatical subject of the verb bara? This is actually where bara is unique, because in all the occurrences, every occurrence where it's used in the Hebrew Bible, only God is the grammatical subject of bara. What that means is that while other verbs of creation like asa and yatsar, a whole range of subjects are used with them because, hey, humans can asa and yatsar, and an animal can, quote unquote, make its young, however it's used. You get a variety of subjects that are used with the other verbs of creation. That does not happen with bara. The grammatical subject of bara is always and only God. And what that means is if you're the biblical writer, if you want to make the special point that, look, I'm going to describe an act of creation here that only God could do, you would use bara. And that's what happens in Genesis 1:1. That's what happens in Genesis 1:26. Even though other verbs are used that very clearly involve creation with pre-existing material, the point of bara is not, did God use anything to create? The point of bara is that only God could do this thing that I'm describing. But you'd only get that if you, again, were able to get a list of all the occurrences where bara appears, where it's used, and then you looked at them and did a little grammar, did a little English grammar, looked at what the grammatical subjects were for that verb, for your study of bara. Again, with software, this just takes seconds, but you could do this kind of thing yourself. And my point is that when you study a word, you need to think about it in terms of its relationship to other words. That might involve looking at synonyms, And it might involve looking at some grammar. We could also look at what is the object of bara. What are the things that get barad as opposed to the subject, the person or entity doing the creating, doing the baraing, if I could say it that way. Again, you have to start thinking about words the way they're used in sentences, and also with respect to synonyms. And it involves a lot more than just getting a list, checking it twice, okay? And, my word's used X number of times in the Old Testament or New Testament or Bible. Well, great. What do you do with that? Again, that's a nice little piece of trivia that you've accumulated to yourself. Usually people do that kind of thing, maybe to put in a sermon. Maybe it has some effect. Maybe it shows that your congregation that you're studying something. But then people will open up a lexicon and look at all the ways that in English, English sort of synonyms, it's a thesaurus approach. Well, what other English words could I use besides create for this word? And that one sounds good here. That sort of breaks up the monotony. I'll talk about that meaning. Okay, that is not doing word study. Doing word study involves looking at how a word is used, where it occurs, again, in relationship to other words, which involve synonyms and some grammar. So until next time, I hope that this is helpful to get you down the road to doing some real word study.